Meaningful places are objectively real to me, but why? Bruce Charlton. For me, there have always been only a few and specific meaningful places, and I feel more or less out of it and adrift anywhere else. Where I live now and the surrounding area is meaningful, and also where I used to live in the southwest, Devon, although I haven't visited there for a very long time, and Somerset. Outside these, not many. London, the south-east, and pretty much all of the Midlands, except the Welsh border counties, e.g. Herefordshire, Shropshire, leave me decidedly cool. I find parts of the Scottish side of the borders to be very magical, and I used to find Edinburgh meaningful, but not for a long time now. And I never found Glasgow meaningful, which was why my time living there made so little an impression. Keswick is a favourite meaningful place, and Stratford-upon-Avon another. The first time I went to Norwich I was very taken by it, but later visits did not confirm this. However, I was very taken by Ely. I've been 3 times, now, and much of rural Fenland, Cambridgeshire, but not Cambridge itself. Oxford, I used to find meaningful, and visited many times across 50 years, but I also found that the magic of the place was progressively fading with every repeat visit. I shall be revisiting soon, and will be curious to see how it is faring. The point of all this is that experience has taught me that there is something objective about whether a place or area is meaningful to me. It's not something I can manufacture by willpower. Places that are theoretically right for me, and which I strove to find meaningful, can stubbornly resist, and remain disenchanted, Glasgow, Cambridge, for instance. While, on the other side, I have also been surprised at how some places grabbed me. Stratford, for instance, I fully expected to find too much of a tourist trap, yet I was actually bowled over, and have had many holidays there. The reason and significance. I think it has something to do with our personal destiny. For reasons we probably will never know, I think we get some kind of inner spiritual guidance, subtle, but decisive and strong, about where we ought to be spending our time, and where not. The latest massive global litmus test. Bruce Charlton. The most recent global litmus test from the totalitarian establishment has been very successful. Almost everybody I have sampled online has failed it. Which is to say, people have taken sides, when both sides are ultimately evil, as intended, such that the Sorathic agenda of chaotic evil has been advanced. The last test on this scale was the Arrakis War, Choam versus the Freeman, which was 2 years ago, so there has been plenty of time to plan this latest. These tests are clever, they aren't easy, they're designed to fascinate, shock, induce fear and anger, dupe, misdirect specifically those who have passed the earlier tests successfully, and this has been achieved. The lesson of the litmus tests, taken together and so far, has been that Christians cannot allow the totalitarian establishment to set, and therefore control, the agenda, our moral focus, our life values, our bottom line principles for discernment. Because if we do allow this, by adopting an assigned role, joining a group, we are thereby consenting to be enlisted into a project of the enemy. We may never know the exact nature of this evil project, indeed there will probably be more than one purpose. But whenever there is a top-down disseminated global frenzy and we feel the pressure to adopt a position, we should recognize what is going on. Spiritual life resides in the personal, not the impersonal. Francis Berger. Although I disagree with many of Nikolai Berdyaev's ideas, I believe his assumptions concerning what constitutes the core of the Christian faith, the very essence of what Christianity is or should be about, hit the mark in most respects. Chief among these is Berdyaev's insistence that inner spiritual experience and creativity are more substantial and consequential than supposed external realities. But IF's emphasis on the internal over the external stems primarily from his overarching belief in personality as a cardinal value and ultimate reality. For but IF, personality embodies the unique, unrepeatable, free, spiritual, and divine aspects of a being, not to be confused with the individual, which but IF regarded as a predominantly natural, material, and social construct. But IF regards the external beyond the realm of personality as secondary to the interior life and the spiritual, subjective world, and often contrasts the external world with the inner freedom and creativity of the spirit. He believes that the external, in the form of society, culture, ritual, and norms, congeal into what he termed objectivization, a deadening, burdensome force that is often at odds with and, ultimately, stifles freedom and creativity. Taken to the extreme, objectivization can potentially lead to dehumanization and despiritualization. Thus, authentic personality and spirituality are grounded in and stem from the internal, which but IF views as the source of vitality, freedom, meaning, and, ultimately, truth. Any drastic shifts away from such an internal focus toward a mainly or, in some cases, purely externalized existence lead to an impersonal existence that invites spiritual decomposition and decay, which eventually renders human beings spiritually powerless against all external forces, particularly those associated with objective reality or societal concepts like the common good. Why is pride often considered the worst sin? Bruce Charlton. The sin of pride is especially insidious and perhaps ineradicable, and an absolute barrier to salvation, because it is the ultimate complacency that I am good enough as I am. Salvation is resurrection, and resurrection is a remaking such that we become wholly good, wholly motivated by love. This includes our recognition that we need remaking, that we need to reject and leave behind that of us which is dissonant with the euphony of divine creation. But if we are spiritually proud, we see no reason why we need to be remade to be fitted for heaven. The proud man wants, instead, that heaven be fitted around himself as is. Such pride seems very common and normal, and is found among the despised, weak, poor and sick, as also, more obviously, among the strong, arrogant and famous. Note, of course, pride is not the only blockage to salvation. Self-hatred is another, because it is ourself who is resurrected. If we hate ourself, we will not desire to be resurrected. The Sun and the Planets. William Wildblood. Nietzsche criticized Christianity as a slave religion which sapped the strength of the masculine virtues as a result of its encouragement of humility and self-abnegation. He said it encouraged weakness and condemned its suppression of natural instincts. For him, Christian runs away from life instead of wholeheartedly embracing it. It cannot be denied that there is this element in Christianity, though not in Christ, and it is one of the reasons many people these days turn to some form of paganism as a more robust and less vitality-draining spiritual approach. There is also an ethnocentric aspect to this in that many Europeans do not wish to adopt what they see as a foreign, specifically, a Jewish, religion. The pagan traditions are regarded as purer and more in keeping with racial identity. But is Christianity as we know it in the West a Jewish religion, or is it really a European one? Although Christ was born a Jew, or half Jewish if you believe the Gospel account of his paternity, the teaching he brought completely overturned the Jewish religion of the time. That is, after all, why he was crucified by the religious authorities or at their behest. That teaching was then absorbed by Europeans and interpreted in the light of their own identity and within the context of their own traditions, Greek philosophy, Roman law and the Germanic/Nordic sense of individuality and freedom, to name the three most important. Christ had to have some particular form, and he had a Jewish form because the Jews of the time had been prepared by God as a receptacle for his advent, But in himself he is universal, and when the religion founded in his name came to Europe, it became completely European. In fact, it was only much later, when the traditional European societal structures were undermined and hierarchies destroyed, that the enfeebling qualities of Christianity were brought out. Tell the Desert Fathers they had a slave religion, tell Saint Benedict, Saint Columba, Saint Francis and a host of others. Tell the Crusaders, or more or less anyone up to the 18th century. It was only when Europe abandoned its traditions and Christianity descended into humanitarianism that it became feminized and lost its spiritual vigor and vitality. Certainly, it was a monastic religion and a priestly religion, and suffered much in the way of corruption, though no more than any other religion and a lot less than most, but it was never life-denying, even if it did prize celibacy for some and chastity for all. So did many other religions. If you are trying to transcend the pull of this world and the lure of matter, you have to take certain steps. It is not denying nature to realize that the sexual instinct needs controlling. On one level, spirit and nature truly are at war, even if on another level they can be reconciled. I mention the attraction of paganism for many people these days, and that it is seen as a more natural and affirmative spiritual approach for the European mindset than Semitic, so-called, it's not really, Christianity. I love many of the pagan traditions, Egyptian, Greek, Celtic, Norse. Many pagan philosophies are replete with wisdom and insight, the Neoplatonic for instance, or the Indian. In my more fanciful moments I speculate that I may have followed some of these paths in previous lives. But there is a problem. All of them have something essential missing. Before Christ it was not known what that was. After him it became obvious what it was. They were stories without the main character, circles with a missing center. It's no accident that the principal pagan deities are associated with planets, and that behind them there is often envisaged a hidden one. They are satellites to the central sun, who is Christ. Before Christ, paganism was a valid spiritual path. It worshipped the one creator God behind all the gods, but with him what was hidden became revealed, and the old religions were superseded. Things being what they are, there were some aspects of Christianity that were lesser expressions of truth than had existed in paganism, even if as a whole it went deeper into the heart of truth and goodness and holiness than paganism ever did or could. And as Christianity lost its force, the further it removed itself from the Spirit of Christ, these shortcomings became more apparent. But no pagan god can approach Christ in terms of spiritual power or divine radiance. And the way many contemporary pagans look on their gods today is as bathed in his light. Just like the planets and the sun. The revived pagan gods have taken on aspects they never had because of Christ, but Christ is the source, and to the extent they have any true spiritual substance, they are just reflecting him. Christianity is not a Jewish religion. It was specifically rejected by the Jews. It is not a weak religion for resentful slaves, simply because it advocates spiritual power over worldly. Christ may have been a servant in this world in order to teach humility, which is the overcoming of the ego, but in heaven he is the great solar hero and a king. Note, I realize that pagans did have deities associated with the sun, but they had to have something along those lines, the sun being of such obvious importance. But these were not ruler deities, so I see them more as placeholders until the real thing manifested itself in Christ. In theology, it impresses me to find evidence of active thinking, rather than defensive parroting. Bruce Charlton. It's a sad, but inevitable, fact that almost all of Christian theology is merely defensive parroting. Which is to say that the discourse is just people expounding arguments and evidences they have learned from sources approved by the church to which they have chosen to affiliate. It is awareness of this parroting quality, on one or both sides, that may produce that sense of frustration at lack of engagement, of unseriousness, of insincerity, or even cowardice, which has been so off-putting to so many modern people who are considering becoming Christians, or who are expressing genuine, not merely expedient, doubts about aspects of their church or Christianity generally. I suppose there must have been some people who were actively thinking about Jesus Christ and Christianity at some point in history. Indeed, I suppose that the letters of Paul are evidence of this kind of grappling. But there has been in Christianity, and very early, and for most, not all, of subsequent history, probably as in most other religions, a strong tendency to draw a line under this thinking for oneself, and a switch to stating, dogmatically, that this primary engagement has been done, the results are in, and the answers are as follows. From which point the idea is that good Christians need to understand and believe, to learn and rehearse, and to parrot. At which point there is no point in talking to them. Arguments are futile. Debate is simulated. Unless, that is, you are merely curious about such people, or if your goal is to become like them, and be guided in all your fundamental life understandings, motivations and choices, by an institution. Which is, evidently, still a popular aspiration, although almost never actually achieved. Further note, I have often myself engaged in this defensive parroting. So I know it by inner experience. For instance, in medicine, doctors' explanations are of this kind, because the doctor has never himself been through the background to medical facts and claims, but is merely repeating what he has been taught or otherwise learned. And of course, most inquiries and dissenting directed at doctors is, almost inevitably, itself shallow and ignorant, or selfish or manipulative. And is not motivated by a genuine desire for discovering truth. But not always. And then it is maddening to have one's one direct enjoyment met with parroting merely. At other times, after becoming a Christian, I sometimes found myself in the same situation. I accepted the truth of some external claim, but did not really know it for myself or from primary experience, and indeed such experience tended to refute the external claim, but I deferred to authority on the basis that cleverer and better informed people than myself had been deemed to have sorted this out long ago. It was really when I, almost against my will, was nigh compelled to dig deeper and deeper towards the most fundamental aspects of Christianity, that I began to find it ever more obvious that this would not be how God would set things up. I mean, I began to feel clear and sure that God would not create us and the world, such that we were supposed to pick some particular social institution, a church, then adopt an attitude of obedient service and trusting credulity to that institution. That would be an absurdly unreliable, fragile, contingent way to plan a system for the salvation of mankind. At around this point, I began to notice when I was parroting about Christianity, and to dislike myself for doing it, and instead felt a necessity to discover the truths by my own thinking and spiritual experience. And to regard such personal engagement as the bottom line for my understanding of reality, rather than regarding Christian faith as deference to and parroting of any particular external source. Another note, why has it become necessary, at least, I would say so, for us actively to think about theology, when in the past it seemed to be not just adequate but often desirable to parrot good authorities? My short answer is that we now live in a totalitarian atheist materialist world, where all institutions, including all churches, are part of a multi-linked bureaucratic system that is intrinsically evil, by which I mean intrinsically in opposition to God, divine creation and salvation. This was not the case in the past, and churches were, at least, in some times and places, overall in harmony with the good, such that obedience to the church was sufficient, and probably the safest path. Furthermore, in the past nearly all men were communal, and substantially lived in a group consciousness, such that individual, and agentic thinking was rare and difficult, whereas now it is the spontaneous default, and indeed difficult to escape, even when we desire to immerse in a shared consciousness. Why is the system so vital to Christians? Francis Berger. Many Christians obsess over the system. Their biggest concern is that the current system is not a Christian system, and they pine for a day when the system will be Christian again. If not that, then at least a more Christian-leaning system, or a system that is not openly anti-Christian. Whichever way they lean, most Christians appear to agree on the fundamental need for a system. System is regarded as a sacred construct that has been inverted. If it is not rescued and reformed, it will continue to decay into utter disorder, which is unthinkable. Thus, the system must be realigned and restored. I don't think such realignment or restoration would do much for Christianity as a whole. Far from being sacred, the system, any human system on earth organizing men into societies, strikes me as a sort of necessary evil, an inevitable part of mortal life, like suffering, entropy, and death. Sure, the system keeps us alive and offers us all sorts of necessities, comforts, and pleasures, but it also has tendency to conflict with and stultify spirit. Christians seem to believe that a Christian system will not exhibit such tendencies, that it will instead nurture and protect spirit. I sense that Christian systems may have offered such nurturing and protection in the past, but it was always at the price of freedom, self-discovery, and personal spiritual growth. Spirit was subjected to and subdued by the external forces of churches, dogma, doctrine, etc. I very much doubt any Christian system would nurture or protect anything today. Quite the opposite. All of that aside, most Christians seem blind to the larger point about the significance and supposed sacredness of system. It strikes me that Jesus was not keen on the system during his life on earth and was mostly uninterested in the machinations and functionings of any system. His teachings are glaringly unsystematic, as is his offer of everlasting life in heaven. Although Christians will argue otherwise and point to the Gospels for proof, I do not believe Jesus' prime mission was the establishment of a system of salvation, let alone an ideal system for earthly life. In fact, I do not think these were even a secondary or tertiary aims. Traditional Christianity, in practice a New Age type of radical traditionalism. Bruce Charlton. I often deep into the writings of John Michel, who had a truly delightful ability to evoke an imaginative and romantic vision of the past, especially of past societies and places. Michel sometimes defined himself a radical traditionalist, in that his lifestyle, methods and society were radical, countercultural and New Age. He is, indeed, regarded as a founder of New Age in Britain, with a delightfully inspiring 1969 book called The View Over Atlantis. A very modern kind of chap, then, eccentric, eclectic, a magpie collector of lost perspectives and knowledge. But Michel consistently advocated traditionalism. His greatest hero was Plato, or more exactly the Neoplatonic, perennialist, tradition that is said to date back at least to Pythagoras, and sees abstract and ideal numbers and geometry as the basis of created reality. Michel wrote and spoke eloquently about the ideal civilization as one of perfect unity, balance and form, a society that was served by its people, who were united and found their deepest satisfaction by their love of divine harmony, and whose life was spent in sustaining that harmony. In spite of his many neo-pagan followers, Michel publicly identified himself as a Christian, in the Catholic tradition of the Church of England, and his vision was a distinctly deistic version of the kind of society most closely approached here during the Merry England era of the Middle Ages. It struck me that even the most ardent and sincere traditionalists among current Christians are much more like John Michel than they are like the denizens of medieval-type societies of the kind they hope shall return. In other words, like it or not, and they would not embrace the label like John Michel did, they are essentially New Age traditionalists, who are inspired in the present by contemplating an imaginative vision of the past. More exactly, I regard New Age spirituality as, approximately, an individual-centered seeking after participation of consciousness, a personal quest for alleviation of modern alienation, often by discovering technologies by which their own consciousness may be manipulated in the desired direction. and the bottom line is whatever works for me. Traditionalist Christians are typically also doing this. They have discovered a religious system, with characteristic ritual, symbolism and sacred books and activities, that work for them in inducing the desired spiritual state. But in most of New Age, this quest may be hedonic, may be wholly here and now and this worldly. While for traditionalist Christians, such effects, while usually present, I mean, joy, or at least pleasure, from living and participating in church-endorsed activities, is subordinated to other worldly goals, perhaps including the transformation of this world into a specifically Christian version of Michel's more generic ideal structure and forms. What I am getting at is that the modern attitude to traditional and, more or less, ideal modeled societies, whether actual and historical or potential and aspired to, is contemplative and imaginative, at best, and because of the actuality of our consciousness, it nearly always takes, as with John Michel, a modern, New Age, and indeed radical form. In sum, traditionalism cannot help but be a radical traditionalism, and this includes individualistic and New Age discernments and evaluations. No matter how viscerally a traditional Christian may despise New Age spirituality, his own religious life shares essentially the same generic aims and methods. No matter how earnestly someone may seek to become a traditionalist like those of the past, our whole attitude and method will be radical, not least because we need actually to be modern society nonconformists and rejectors, that is radicals in pursuit of becoming, it is hoped, at some point in the future, obedient traditional society acceptors. I regard this as an inevitable constraint, a product of the way that we now are, and the way that our consciousness is set up, individualist and agentic, spontaneously alienated, inescapably fated to make personal discernments and evaluations. For a Christian, truth is never just my truth, but for a modern Christian, strong and motivating saving truth needs also to be my truth, in a way that was not the case in the past. Thus the spiritually effective Christian life will inevitably share some version of the New Age seeking quest, and will be calibrated by means of a spiritual responsivity that may well be individually distinctive, or else rare among the mass of people. Christian theology ought to build upon our innate, spontaneous, natural assumptions, not subvert them. Bruce Charlton. Since the Creator is a personal and good God who loves us, it seems to make sense that we would be born into this world with the kind of assumptions, hence understanding, that is supportive, or, at least, compatible with, our salvation. I regard this as a deep truth, and that the animistic consciousness of young childhood, the assumption of inhabiting a living universe of other beings, is therefore a true understanding of reality. Truth about reality is therefore something originally inside us, within us, something we do not need to look for elsewhere, or to other people, to find. In other words, if truth about reality is inborn, within, divinely implanted, then it is something we can know for ourselves, from ourselves, and therefore be sure about. This means that much of Christian theology is false when it asserts that ultimate realities are impersonal, and or abstract in nature, or too complex to comprehend. This is a lethal objection to Christian theology when it is asserted to be something that need to be derived second-hand, from other people or other places, a kind of hearsay, that we are supposed to obey, uncomprehendingly if necessary. From this perspective it is also clear that mainstream modern materialism, which inculcates and permeates assumptions that ultimate reality is a dead, purposeless, meaningless, a matter of physical and chemical processes, is false. And, insofar as Christian theology tries to incorporate materialism, then to that extent it makes itself incoherent, self-subverting. What modern materialism and mainstream Christian theology both do to a person, is inculcate the assumption that he must get his understanding from outside himself, because both replace our innate childhood worldview, with some other worldview that we must find somewhere in our culture. When people are looking around to other people or social systems to understand the world, then Satan holds most of the cards, and the Christian truth becomes just another option among many more, lost among a much larger and constantly changing mass of alternatives. Even when people become Christian under such circumstances, and with such an external seeking mindset, then it becomes very difficult to have strong faith, i.e. difficult to have sureness and confidence in the rightness of our particular worldview. Once we leave behind the innate, and God-given, perspective that the true understanding has been built into us, then any and every worldview that comes from outside is a threat to our present conviction. In a world where truth is not innate, where truth is said to be, or may be, external, abstract, impersonal, hyper-complex, then we find ourselves trying to cling to a particular and second-hand/adopted understanding. And constantly being offered alternative external views, constantly under attack from external world views, constantly needing to defend and justify our specific choices. No wonder Christian faith is so feeble, when we have built it under the assumption that our childhood knowledge is something that is merely immature, and needs to be set aside, such that we must derive truth about reality from sources outside ourselves, from among the many alternative offered by people and by culture. We can never really believe other people sufficiently to have a strong faith, unless, perhaps, all of those other people are saying the same thing, which nowadays they certainly never are, not even within the strictest of churches. All too often, Christianity succeeds in subverting our natural childhood assumptions with abstract and complex theological dogmas, and succeeds only in enfeebling the consequent faith. As was made blazingly evident in 2020. I conclude that, from here and now, the truth of Christianity must, if Christian faith is to be strong, therefore be such that it can simply be added on to the innate and spontaneous assumptions about reality with which God provided us on entering incarnation, and with which we are, apparently, all born. Belief in the Hereafter, Glenn Gould. Bruce Charlton. This passage is quoted in 32 short films about Glenn Gould, and also Glenn Gould. Hereafter.
Elise Mock, I'd like to ask, do you believe in the afterlife? Glenn Gould, well, I was brought up as a Presbyterian, though I did stop being a churchgoer, about the age of 18, but I always have had a tremendously strong sense that there is, indeed, a hereafter, that we all must reckon with, and lead our lives according to, this belief that there is, inevitably, a transformation of the spirit. As a consequence, I find all here and now philosophies quite repellent, lax, if you will. I do recognize, however, that it is a great temptation to try and formulate a comfortable theory of eternal life, so as to reconcile oneself to the inevitability of death. But I'd like to think that's not what I'm doing. I honestly don't think that I'm creating a deliberate self-reassuring process. For me, it intuitively seems right. I've never had to work at convincing myself of a life hereafter. After all, don't you think it seems infinitely more plausible than its opposite, oblivion?
There is surely a direct relationship between Gould's conviction of the reality of a personal afterlife, and the extraordinary and unique spiritual dimension he brought to the best of his life and performances. When I am able to grasp the fact of it, I am absolutely staggered at the perfection of the gift of Jesus, I mean resurrected eternal life in heaven. It is so absolutely and exactly what I would most have wanted. Yet most people, most of the time, almost everybody, almost always, are utterly insensible to this extraordinary thing. I know, because for most of my life I was one of them. I know how, in the particular and peculiar environment of this modern era, it seems natural, as well as adult and intelligent, to adopt a flippant attitude to this most important of all questions. I know the arguments, from the inside, about how eternal life, resurrection, heaven etc., don't really make any difference to the wise man of true values, how these are childish panderings to the weakness and vanity of etc. etc. Consequently, we do not allow ourselves even to begin to grasp what is actually on offer, and oscillate back and forth between regarding the astonishing gift of Jesus as too good to be true, and then of no interest at all, or, somehow, hold both beliefs at the same time. One common, and stunningly wrong, attitude is that the reality of eternal life makes no difference to this life. I have felt this myself. It is so incredibly, stupidly and obviously wrong, that such an attitude is itself a key to much of the pathology of modern thinking. I mean, the fact that I and others can and do think this way, is a revelation of a profound, i.e. deep-rooted, incapacity to reason that is near universal. I realize that Jesus' offer does not appeal to everyone. Which is presumably why only Christianity, and only some understandings of Christianity, offer this destination after death. But I think there are plenty who, like me, want nothing different from what Jesus offers, and it ought to be a simple matter for us to get past the first step of acknowledging yes, that's what I most want, and, but only, then move on to the question, is it true? Step 1, do we want what Jesus offers? Step 2, is the offer true? And, as Gould said, evaluating the truth of Jesus' offer is a matter of intuition. No evidence is of relevance. But intuition must have something to intuit. An idea must be grasped with the fullness of imaginative understanding before it can be tested by intuition. And that is exactly where most modern people go so fatally wrong. We cannot imaginatively grasp the reality of resurrected, eternal heavenly life, or, we do not allow ourselves to do this, therefore we cannot intuitively evaluate its truth. We cannot get past step 1. Note, this post seems significant to me. It is reblogged from September of 2020, at which it passed without apparent notice. Totalitarianism and/or chaos, Ahrimanic backlash and/or Sorathic escalation in response to the latest global litmus test. Bruce Charlton. The latest global litmus test, aka the most recent establishment agenda theme, is playing out negatively and for evil, as any change must, when not motivated by positive good. Whatever the original intent of the event and its propagation may have been, the existing establishment power blocks are competing over what it implies. Competing, often within different parts of the same media outlet, as would be expected when there is a genuine schism and civil war within the establishment. We need to be clear that in this war, both sides are of evil intent, but different types of evil. On one side, and this includes the political right, actually, part of the left, and this also includes the nationalistic Christian right, there are the Ahrimanic totalitarians. These desire, first and foremost, an efficient and effective international system. A coherent political bureaucracy media complex. And the Ahrimanic totalitarians are trying to escalate, and use the new establishment agenda to make the system work better, mainly so far by undoing some of the more egregious consequences of political correctness. This is the true nature of whatever is real in the anti-woke backlash assiduously reported by the mainstream sources. What motivates these system reformers is a materialistic and this worldly desire for a more comfortable, prosperous, and secure life, first and especially for themselves, and those of whom they approve. To be done by means of working towards an effective and efficient system. This is why there is such a strong enthusiasm among such people, for ruthless coercion of individuals justified by rational objectives and the common good. In other words, enemies are to be made to conform to the new rules of a better system. For a truly Ahrimanic totalitarian, this coercion of conformity is done impersonally, without sadism, because it is the result of objective calculation of system necessity. In sum, for mainstream establishment totalitarians, it is the individual person's role, whether voluntarily or coerced, to serve the system. The only difference between the political right and the Christian right is that the system to be ruthlessly imposed is intended to be one that is explicitly Christian in its forms, a church system. Insofar as any totalitarian bureaucracy can really be Christian when it is intrinsically evil. Consequently, our old friend the Boromir strategy is very much in evidence. The political/Christian right advocate using the weapons of the enemy, including the psychological motivations of leftist materialism, rationalized by the excuse that this is the most effective way to win. Under the assumption that our system winning, by whatever means are judged to be expedient, is the same thing as good. In sum, for Christian totalitarians, it is the individual person's role, whether voluntarily or coerced, to serve the church system. Mixed in with totalitarianism, of various stripes, and sometimes dominant, is explicit expression, across the board, including the right, including among self-identified Christians, of the characteristically sadistic emotions of spiteful schadenfreude. In other words, we see the fingerprints of strengthening Sorathic, chaotic evil. This is motivated mainly by personal gratification at the sufferings and destruction of enemies, or, at first enemies. Instead of the impersonal and calculating harmonic justification of coercive imposition for reasons of systemic necessity, the Sorathic right will characteristically express positive pleasure in the need for imposing suffering on their enemies. They typically express delight at the prospect of the misery and destruction of those who will not conform to the new program. But later, as evil feeds upon itself, they will go on to enjoy the suffering and destructions of anybody and anything that opposes or ignores our personal interests and enjoyments. And finally, the ultimately nihilistic destruction of divine creation, and at last, the suicidal annihilation of their own self, as something created by God. In other words, because people are currently riled up and feel free to express their dark and usually secret motivations, we can currently observe the inevitable waxing of evil that happens when both sides are actually rival factions of the spiritual war that opposes God and divine creation. Both totalitarian and chaotic evil are, in their different but overlapping ways, de facto working towards the self-chosen damnation of self-righteous sinners. In other words, all varieties of evil are working towards an increase of the self-exclusion of the unrepentant from heaven, which self-exclusion includes those unrepentant for whom this worldly expediency is affirmed as primary. Those for whom their superficial assertion of wanting a more Christian world and future heaven has become an insincere excuse for advocating and doing more evil now. Note added, I would like to clarify that I intend the term church system, which I judge to be the large, or at least vociferous, majority of Christians who identify with the right or nationalism, to refer to those whose priority is system. Here and now, in this world, and starting from where we actually are. I mean those many who, at worst, explicitly or covertly, regard their favored Christian church as the best or only means to what they really and most deeply want, which is an effective, efficient and us-orientated social system. Looking back some 15 plus years, I can see that I was one of these at the time I converted to Christianity. I wanted what I hoped the right church might do for society during my mortal life and those I love, more than I wanted to follow Jesus to heaven. I also mean the term church systematists to include others, less culpable perhaps, who, sincerely and without covertly pursued primary self-interest, regard system as a necessary materialistic means to the salvific, and next worldly and spiritual end, of what the uncorrupted Christian church is advocate. That is to say, the church system totalitarians include those who want system reform first, to be followed, some unspecified time later, by top-down and imposed Christianization, made possible by the attainment of power, i.e. the Boromir strategy. These are blind or foolish, if sincere, but not so strategically bad as those who merely desire to use the churches for material ends. But I do not mean to include in the church system category, those real Christians who retain loyalty to the spiritual goals of their church in its ideal form, those who, by discernment and personal evaluation, seek and follow the Christian truth among the lies and expediencies of the totalitarian affiliated human institutions of the actual churches of 2025. Some Christian churches yet retain the capacity to help individuals in their Christian faith, with political considerations as secondary and derivative consequences of this primary faith. Giving up on clear and effective communication, Footway bureaucratic notices. Bruce Charlton. I noticed this on the interminable, clearly maliciously motivated, roadworks on the Great North Road, and I thought, who the dickens decided that pavement or footpath, terms that everybody from the youngest child to oldest codger understands, should instead be called a footway? But a moment's reflection was enough. The bureaucrats it is, together with their friends the politicians, who always and endlessly decide to rename things. Rename them without regard for clarity of communication or traditional associations, and in accordance with their own incentive structures that reward institutional change, including change for the sake of change, or change for the worse, it does not matter which. That the purpose, the only proper purpose, of a sign is to communicate information, and that Footway fails to do this, is irrelevant to the bureaucrats/politicians, and fellow travelers. I first noticed this more than 20 years ago when I saw that the road signs and marking in Hay-on-Wye, which straddles the border between England and Wales, had important instructional highway signage in a bilingual form, with Welsh coming first. Presumably this is for the benefit of the non-existent hordes of monoglot Welsh who could pass their driving tests only in Cymraeg. The 99.99 recurring % of road users who can only be distracted and delayed by the priority of a foreign phrase, and who need to read the English in order to obey the important and urgent traffic instruction, are irrelevant compared with the all-conquering bureaucratic imperative of making a point. In 1974 the then Conservative government gratuitously abolished or renamed many of the traditional counties of the UK. My then place of residence, Somerset, was renamed Avon. Most egregious was the Scottish county of Clackmannanshire charmingly became Central Region. Some of these changes were later reverted by popular demand. Settling in Yercaud. William Wildblood. It was now December of 1980. After 8 months in India, Michael Lord and I had finally found somewhere we could run as a guest house, which was our purpose for being in India. Or at least it was the way we intended to make ends meet. Our primary motivation was to lead a contemplative life, for which at the time India was still more conducive than the West. And then, as we found out later, the masters had taken us away from England, because of the great cultural changes that were about to take place there and throughout the Western world in the 1980s. In the 60s there had been the feeling in many quarters that a new stage of consciousness was about to unfold. On the popular level this translated into the beliefs and practices associated with the so-called New Age movement, but everywhere there was something in the air, a sense that the old ways were passing and new, supposedly more enlightened, ways would arise to replace them. However confused, misunderstood, trivialized and, in many ways, ignorant this feeling was, it existed. But every action sets up its own reaction. The world was not about to become more spiritual, as many naively hoped. It was going to get even more materialistic. The positive energy of the time was captured and rerouted. In the UK the Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher arose to deal with the excesses of socialism, but the cure to that ill was equally detrimental to the spiritual health of the nation. I am not some rabid anti-Thatcherite because I believe in a free market, and it is obvious that her brand of politics came about in response to the greed and corruption of the left, but it brought with it a materialism and corrupt capitalism of its own. From a societal point of view, it was every man for himself. The moral fiber of the country, already in freefall, took a dive. In different ways and to different degrees this happened all over the West. Living in India in the 1980s, I didn't see it as it was going on. I had very little contact with Western media and wasn't particularly interested. But on my return I could see the changes that had occurred. The descent into deeper materialism, now unchecked by the vestiges of a religious sensibility, the vulgarity, the coarseness. This wasn't just caused by the new form of right-wing politics, because the reaction of the left to those politics caused as much if not more spiritual degradation. In different but complementary ways each side did its own damage, and we are living with the results of that today. One could point to many other periods recently when things took a turn for the worse. Again, in the UK, which is what I know best, the election of Tony Blair, the abbreviation of the Christian name reeking of fake egalitarianism, was another and sharper arrow in the spiritual heart of the nation. But from the perspective of someone just setting out on the spiritual path as I was in the early 1980s, it was better that I was removed from the increasingly materialistic atmosphere of the time until I'm more firmly grounded and better able to withstand it. We are all affected by our environment and adopt its behavioral patterns to an extent. A sapling often needs protective fencing around it while it is in early stages of growth if it is in an unfavorable environment. India was my fencing then, though not because it was a particularly spiritual place. It wasn't, but it did still value the spiritual and hadn't totally succumbed to materialism. I doubt you could say that now. The property Michael had bought was on a hillside about a quarter of a mile from the town. It spread over 3 levels or terraces. Just to the right of the entrance on the lowest level there was the well, which was necessary as there was no mains water in the town at that time. All larger properties had their own well, and Yercaud itself had a big well in the center with a few smaller ones here and there. Water was not usually a problem as long as one was sensible, except in the summer when several wells would go dry. Ours only dried up once during a particularly hot summer when we had guests in the bungalow who insisted on washing their clothes every day and using a lot of water to do so. We asked them not to, but they carried on. They also smuggled in over a dozen people to a bungalow that had 3 double bedrooms and was priced accordingly. When challenged, they insisted that there were only 6 adults, the rest were servants and children who didn't count because they slept on the floor. We had to ask them to leave, and as the head of this family was the police chief from Salem, things could have got awkward, but since the well was about to run dry he was ready to leave anyway, so there were no repercussions, which, given how power operates in India, there might well have been. The bungalow we ran as a guest house was on the same level as the well. It had a veranda that ran along 2 sides of the house, a large central area with a high ceiling for coolness, and 3 bedrooms. There were bathroom areas rather than fitted bathrooms, meaning there was just a lavatory, a tap and space to pour water over yourself with a 6-inch high ridge around it to stop the water sloshing everywhere. The water ran out through a hole in the wall that led to an external open drain. The idea was that the water would evaporate in the sun, which is what generally happened. The drain ran for a few yards and then stopped, so any residual water would just seep into the ground. Initially there were no lavatories in this lower bungalow, so we had to install a couple and put a septic tank in to deal with the waste. After a few years this tank had to be emptied, and believe it or not there was a man who climbed in and did the job by hand. He was a very jovial fellow. I suppose if you do a job like that you have to be able to look on the bright side. If you work in an office and are bored by your 9-to-5 existence, always remember, it could be worse. We had bought the property from a lawyer who administered it on behalf of the estate of the previous owners. These had been a couple of English spinsters who had died a few years before. They were daughters of a missionary, and had lived their entire lives in India. It must have been a lonely existence after most of their compatriots had gone back to the UK, but they knew nothing else. Neither of them had ever left India, so it was their country, though I imagine they had always been outsiders and their isolation seems to have made them increasingly eccentric. Apparently they would take books out of the local library and cut out pages which contained anything of a remotely sexual nature. As this library was housed in a club which had been the social centre for the British coffee planters, most of whom had left by the mid-50s, after which no new books were bought, the controversial elements would have been innocent by today's standards. I was actually grateful for this library because the lack of up-to-date books meant I read a lot of 19th century literature that I never would have done otherwise. These books were the only form of entertainment and information I had for nearly 5 years. I read modern works before and I have done afterwards, though practically no fiction, but I do think those years of only reading books written in a less spiritually corrupt age served me well. We lived in the bungalow on the upper terrace. Behind this the hill extended further for several hundred yards, where it was a kind of scrub jungle. At the back of the house the hill had been cut away to leave a natural wall about 12 feet high, and this had grown over with various plants including morning glory and wild pomegranate. The kitchen looked out onto this wall, and instead of a solid door just had a wooden frame about 5 feet wide by 6 feet high, lined with a wire grill. We usually left this open during the day for air and light, and this was responsible for a little adventure I had. I was cooking lunch around midday when I heard a commotion coming from the wall behind the house. Then there was a crash and a lot of vegetation tumbled into the kitchen. This was immediately followed by the cause of the commotion. A python around 10 feet long whose momentum carried him right up to my feet. He looked at me and I looked at him, and then we both turned round and shot off in opposite directions, me into the house and him out of it. But after the initial shock I turned back and followed him. It's not every day you get a 10-foot python in your kitchen. He was going down the wastewater gully at the back and going so fast that he disappeared into the jungle before I could catch up with him, which was probably just as well. I wrote about this encounter more extensively a few years ago. https://meetingthemasters. blogspot.com/2018/06/mysnakestories.html. High levels of system participation preclude final participation. Francis Berger. Although I am not very well versed in Barfield's ideas concerning participation, I think I have grasped the basic concepts enough to understand that the final participation Barfield envisioned is virtually impossible without a high level of detachment from the system. Barfield advocated for a conscious re-engagement with the world that synthesized analytical and logical thinking, alpha thinking, with our intuitive and imaginative thinking to fully perceive and, more significantly, actively participate in the spiritual that underpins all creation. Such active participation raises consciousness to a state of co-creation, that is, the fusing of imagination and reason to not just perceive but assiduously participate in creating deeper and richer interactions with and experiences of reality, creation. Barfield also suggested that such active, final, participation would dissolve the demarcation line currently separating the perceiver from the perceived. Original participation entailed an absence of systems or extremely rudimentary systems that were spiritually attuned to the aliveness of everything in creation. The eventual rise of systems dissolved original participation and detached consciousness from its immersion in creation. Consciousness shifted from being spiritually attuned and fully immersed in creation toward a state of self-awareness and detachment. The separation between the perceiver and the perceived was established, and became fully entrenched. Consciousness essentially became alienated from its source. The rise of self-consciousness allowed analytical, logical, and conceptual thinking to flourish. However, it came at the cost of fortifying the false barrier man had constructed between himself and creation. Spiritual systems were able to bridge this gap to some degree through symbols and rituals. However, the symbols and rituals lost their power over time, and spiritual systems essentially became bridges to nowhere. Barfield adamantly maintained that a return to original participation was neither possible nor desirable, implying that final participation should involve the reimagining and recreation of the sorts of systems that dissolved original participation. Nevertheless, it is quite clear that Barfield also did not advocate for a return to the same sorts of spiritual systems, churches, that came to dominate consciousness after they had eclipsed original participation. It also seems clear that a divinely minded consciousness cannot be the product of a system. Put another way, systems cannot induce final participation. Hence, final participation must occur at the personal and individual level first. Whether that spills over into any sort of system and what kind of system such a system would actually be is secondary. At present, I can only imagine final participation at the group level within a family or a small circle of friends, but such a development would seem to require simultaneous experiences of final participation within individuals who then recognize such developments in themselves and others. Returning to the main point expressed in the first paragraph of this post, I am firmly convinced that final participation is virtually impossible without a high level of detachment from our current system, primarily because our current system is brazenly anti-God and anti-creation, and yes, this sadly includes the bulk of what constitutes Christian organizations and institutions. Our current system is not only anti-God and anti-creation, it is also opposed to divine-mindedness. Thus, high-level attachment to the system precludes the fostering and nurturing of the divine consciousness Barfield envisioned. Final participation involves the generation of co-creation. Spiritual participation in our current system is only likely to induce co-destruction. Believing that divine consciousness is somehow the product of a system and that spiritual systems of the past can nurture and foster divine consciousness are telltale signs of high levels of attachment to the system. Despite beliefs to the contrary, reforming the system will not generate the kind of divine-mindedness Barfield envisioned. If we are serious about becoming more divinely minded, then we must forego a high level of system attachment. At the present time, this appears to entail adopting an innate but not of its spiritual perspective that forgoes temptations to improve, reform, restructure, or rectify the system in favor of actively re-engaging with creation at a deeper, more unified level. To sum up, high levels of spiritual participation in the system hinder, if not outright prevent, the divinely minded consciousness required for final participation in creation. Nothing quite so nerve-rending, quite so demoralizing, as the sight and sound of the Stuka. Bruce Charlton.
Theoretically, there is no target so easy to hit as a plane approaching directly head-on. In practice, it never worked out that way. In the Arctic, the Mediterranean, the Pacific, the relative immunity of the torpedo bombers, the high percentage of successful attacks carried out in the face of almost saturation fire, never failed to confound the experts. Tension, over-anxiety, fear, these were part of the trouble. At least, there are no half measures about a torpedo bomber, you get him or he gets you. And there is nothing more nerve-wracking, always, of course, with the outstanding exception of the screaming, near-vertical power dive of the gull-winged Stuka dive bomber, than to see a torpedo bomber looming hugely, terrifyingly over the open sights of your gun and know that you have just 5 inexorable seconds to live. Any plane that hurtles down in undeviating dive on waiting gun emplacements has never a chance. Thus spoke the pundits, the instructors in the gunnery school of Whale Island, and proceeded to prove to their own satisfaction the evident truth of their statement, using A guns and duplicating the situation which would arise insofar as it lay within their power. Unfortunately, they couldn't duplicate the Stuka. Unfortunately, because in actual battle, the Stuka was the only factor in the situation that really mattered. One had only to crouch behind a gun, to listen to the ear-piercing, screaming whistle of the Stuka in its near-vertical dive, to flinch from its hail of bullets as it loomed larger and larger in the sights, to know that nothing could now arrest the flight of that underslung bomb, to appreciate the truth of that. Hundreds of men alive today, the lucky ones who endured and survived a Stuka attack, will readily confirm that the war produced nothing quite so nerve-rending, quite so demoralizing as the sight and sound of those junkers with the strange dihedral of the wings in the last seconds before they pulled out of their dive.
I have recently finished reading, actually listening to the excellently read audiobook, of Alistair MacLean's HMS Ulysses. This was an absolutely superb war novel, MacLean's first, and written from personal experience, and, clearly, from the heart. The numerous characters are convincing and, mostly, empathic, including that rarest of types, a really good man. The situations are vividly and memorably described, the trajectory is stepwise, almost merciless, cranking up of power and horror. The above passages are vivid evidence of the unique ability of the Stuka, the best Axis dive bomber, indeed the best pure dive bomber ever, in terms of accuracy, as a weapon in which the element of induced terror was so great, as to lift its tactical effectiveness to another level beyond its mechanical capabilities. Consequently, as an anti-shipping weapon, the Ju-87 destroyed more Allied shipping than all other aircraft types put together. Knowing Jesus from personal experience, how is it done? Bruce Charlton. Meeting Jesus in a dream. What does it mean? How should we understand it? I suppose that, for a Christian to have strong faith, he needs to know Jesus from personal experience. But what does this actually mean, in practice? And in a world where there is an apparently infinite amount of conflicting advice concerning how to do it. Where should one even begin to look? Most sources of advice on how to know Jesus will direct us at specific secondary and second-hand sources, that need first to be discerned and recognized as true, among a mass majority of other sources of information that are required to be rejected, and then the information provided about Jesus needs to be understood. This will not suffice for obvious reasons, including failure to locate, failure to evaluate correctly, failure to comprehend correctly. And it observably does not suffice for most people most of the time, who never get to know Jesus. To know Jesus, indeed to know anything, we need to know it directly, unmediated. Know from inner contact, yes, but specifically the contact of love. This knowing is and must be simple, because it must be comprehended by a single mental moment. With Jesus, the need and purpose is to have a clear and simple apprehension by which we know a few things, whether separately or perhaps all at once, such as what he offers us, that this offer is real, and what to do if we want to accept his offer. This experience of direct knowing is what matters, but it does not matter how this experience is achieved. Possible examples of how people get to know Jesus include the usual religious activities, scripture, ritual, symbolism, churches, prayer, meditation, spiritual and physical disciplines. It may include divinely purposed experiences in this mortal life, such as miracles, answered prayers. Or it may include dreams near death, or post-mortal encounters, for example meeting Jesus, meeting a beloved resurrected person. But in practice, how we get to know Jesus may also include many negative experiences, such as realization of death, rock-bottom despair, extreme fear, sin, loneliness. Therefore, in principle, almost anything that induces a turning away which becomes a turning toward may lead a person to experience Jesus directly and personally. So much for the direct experience, but this is useless unless recognized as such. If we insist on rendering the clarity and simplicity of direct knowing into indirect forms, by translating into words, concepts, pictures, then we have made it into something abstract, complex, ambiguous. Into something that requires theoretical interpretation. Consider the example of a dream. In a dream we may meet Jesus in visual or audio imagery, and there is a strong tendency to focus on dream content, what Jesus looked like, what he did, what he taught us. Thus we get misleadingly caught up by trying to interpret the meaning, decode the message, understand the implications. But the proper way to understand this kind of dream, or any other experience of Jesus, is to disregard specific content, and instead reflect on what we know experientially in consequence, and know so simply and so clearly that we can grasp it whole. Note added, the above came from my reflecting upon how it is that the fourth Gospel, John, had become so important to me over the past years, its simple and clear message hitting me with the force of revelation, but that I would not expect other people to learn from reading it in the same way. For me, that particular means worked towards the desired end. But for other people, a very wide range of means might lead to the same end. In sum, the means to the end are personal, contextual, hence idiosyncratic. The problem is that, for too many people, being given the right answer is insufficient, because they are set up to reject any answer when that answer is simple. Furthermore, as I said in a comment over at Francis Berger's place, it is a huge change of attitude required, from people assuming that reality is going to be something forced upon them, almost irresistibly, by external power, to recognizing that, as of here and now, people who want to know reality must make an explicit choice and pursue reality actively, and as an individual. That people do not do this is partly from psychological factors such as laziness and wrong priorities, but also most people assume that any belief or knowledge that is actively chosen on the basis of inner conviction, no matter how solidly affirmed that conviction, must be just engaged in a wishful thinking fantasy. The change of human consciousness throughout my lifespan. Bruce Charlton. We all begin our lives in the state of immersive, spontaneous, initially unconscious original participation, which was, pretty much, the consciousness of mature adults in the earliest, for example hunter-gatherer, phase of human history, a state of mind when we are in direct contact with an animistic, living, purposive, aware, universe of beings/spirits, gods. The medieval consciousness, aka intellectual soul, is that of the great span of recorded human history, of agricultural society, of civilization, the axial age when religions were developed, changing through the ancient Egyptian, for example, ancient Greek, Roman and into the medieval era. During this era, spirituality was largely communal, and contact with the world of spirit, experience of the spirit within us, was via intermediaries such as church structures, priests, symbolism and ritual. For Christians this type of consciousness reached a peak in the Byzantine and Holy Russian societies of Orthodox Catholicism, and for Westerners it peaked in the medieval times with Roman Catholicism in Western Europe. Modern consciousness, in which man is alienated from God, the gods, the world of spirits, and other beings, began to emerge with the Renaissance and Reformation, as traditional forms and symbols began to lose their objectivity and power, and accelerated through the Industrial Revolution up to now. So that now it seems obvious common sense that this is a purposeless, meaningless, dead universe, going nowhere, and in which we humans and individual persons are irrelevant, such that our morality is merely maximizing pleasure and minimizing suffering until we die and are annihilated. Looking back, it now seems that I experienced the dying residuum of the medieval consciousness, which, although relatively feeble and only among a minority, was behind the radicalism of the countercultural desire for a simple, natural, agrarian, and essentially modified medieval life and society. My point is that until the late 1970s a restoration of medieval consciousness actually seemed a realistic possibility, such that alternative living and self-sufficiency were topics of mainstream social discussion and aspiration. The revival of folk music and arts, and even hippie styles of dress and fashion, all seemed to presage this. It really seemed possible then that we might go back to a village-based and agricultural society, on lines described earlier by William Cobbett, and depicted fictionally by William Morris. Much of the mass youth interest in Tolkien was related to the hope aroused by his work that a Middle-earth kind of life might yet be genuinely possible. And for some, but not me, at that time, this included an expectation that Christianity would again have a central and pervasive influence on society, a Chesterton/Belloc type distributism. But through my lifespan the medieval consciousness has faded in objectivity and power, until now it is not regarded as a realistic possibility, or only except in a remote, abstract, wishful and as if kind of fashion. This can be seen in the disintegration, decline and corruption of all the major Christian churches, and their extreme alienation and giving up of shaping spiritual experience. But the most significant decline of medieval consciousness, and the cause of church changes, is in the minds of men, an inexorable dwindling which I have both experienced and observed. This is where we find ourselves. I regard these changes in consciousness as objective, as causal, and as irreversible. So it is from here that we ought to regard the future. Since we cannot go back, and, further, my experience and observations suggest that trying to revert ourselves and society to medievalism of consciousness is not just ineffective, but actually spiritually harmful. That, at any rate, is how I read the various utopian experiments in Back to the Land, communal and alternative living. Since what we have now is so dominated by the powers of evil, and so devoid of both purpose and meaning and hope, it seems to me that it is imperative we actively and consciously attempt to move our consciousness, and consequently our lives, forward into nigh unprecedented territory. Note, it may sound, from the above, as if I regarded original participation and medieval consciousness as taboo, necessarily harmful and to be shunned, but this is not the case. For many people, in many situations, both still have much to offer in the way of therapy, encouragement, and even guidance. However, the point I wish to emphasize is that they are not enough. They are both too feeble for what is necessary in our world, and both are harmful if made a strategy. They cannot suffice. There is no future in them. The recent solar eclipse. William Wildblood. This is the chart for the recent solar eclipse on 21st September. That also happened to be my birthday, and the eclipse was just a couple of degrees off my natal sun. The eclipse was late in the day and I was born shortly after midnight, hence the distance between degrees for the same day. That is significant enough, but an additional factor is Saturn directly opposite at 28 degrees of Pisces, which is even closer to a direct opposition to my Sun at 27 Virgo. So far nothing untoward seems to have happened other than a leak from a pipe in my bathroom that went through the ceiling in the room below and did quite a lot of damage. It was discovered an hour after the eclipse. A leak might involve the water sign of Pisces and also Neptune, which is conjunct Saturn here, but it does not have any connection with an eclipse. However, it is said that the effects of an eclipse may start several days before it takes place and continue for up to 3 months afterwards. An eclipse on your natal sun is supposed to herald new beginnings and potentially dramatic changes. With Saturn involved, there can be increased responsibilities and new limitations as well. This was my 70th birthday, so you might say all those factors come into play. But then everyone gets to 70 who lives that long, and not everyone has this pattern on their birthday, so I doubt that is all there is to it. It will be interesting to see what, if anything, goes on in my life in the next few weeks. The energies involved in astrology, whatever they are, can be processed internally if one is in tune with the cosmos and consciously aware of oneself and one's personal shortcomings. If one is unconscious, and, let's face it, we all are to some extent or we wouldn't be here, they can manifest externally in the form of events that occur. I intend to be as aware as possible of my thought processes and emotional reactions in the coming weeks. Perhaps this is a good opportunity for me to watch myself more closely than usual and bring things I should be doing anyway, but often neglect to do, into sharper focus. When I first saw the conjunction of the eclipse with my sun, I felt mildly apprehensive. I've had experiences with eclipses before, as mentioned in Meeting the Masters. But then the thought popped into my head. Don't be like the heathen. Trust in God. I don't normally think in terms of heathens, but that was the word as it appeared in my thoughts. I take it to mean that I should not be superstitious because of this, or that pattern in the sky. The stars, so-called, do reflect the workings of creation, but above them there is the Creator, and one should always have confidence that whatever may play out in our lives down here on earth is always for our spiritual good. The planets are like the gods, but the gods are the servants of God who is beyond them all. Willpower characterized the spirituality of the religious elite during the era of medieval consciousness. Bruce Charlton. Religions, as we know them, emerged in the era of medieval consciousness, which was a millennia-long transition between the immersive passive unconsciousness of original participation and the current alienated modern consciousness. There were, perhaps, two main forms of religion, one for the masses, the other for elite religious specialists. The medieval mass consciousness was based on obedience to the religious institutions, and spiritual participation was made possible by intermediary phenomena, such as symbol, ritual, scripture, song, or social dynamics. The medieval elite consciousness was based upon control of the whole person by willpower, that is, by human will aligned with divine will. The basic idea of medieval era elite consciousness was that a human being might discover the divine will, and then organized his life around the process of getting his own will into accord with the divine, and the totality of his behavior into accord with his own divine-aligned will. So, the religious life was about prolonged discipline and training, for example varieties of initiation, aiming towards conscious goals. If successfully, the will was directed at the divine, and mastered all aspects of behavior, to produce a transformed person, the higher type being described in various terms, holy, enlightened, and adept, etc. Since the religious elites led the masses, and the obedience of the masses was directed at the religious elites, it was vital that there was sufficient alignment between elite and divine will. Usually, in most places, most of the time, there was not sufficient human-divine alignment. But sometimes and in some places there was, so it remained a valid ideal, especially in a world where individual consciousness was not much developed in most people. This idea of subordinating the whole of life to an elite will, purportedly aligned with the divine will, was a good thing insofar as the human will really was aligned with the divine will. And also insofar as the medieval mode of consciousness infused this process of deployment of human will with the spirit. Because otherwise the whole thing was merely legalism, with all the ambiguities and imprecision intrinsic to the interpretation of language. It is this second aspect of the spirit infusing the human will, that has changed so much in the modern era, such that now the religious elites seldom even claim seriously to be highly aligned with divine will. Indeed, elite religious authority is usually based upon the same modes as the secular, that is to say institutional legitimacy, laws, rules, guidance understood as normal language, and in practice interpreted in the secular ways that such language is interpreted, for example legalistically, by historical and linguistic analysis, quasi-scientifically, etc. What the modern era is left with, is therefore the forms of medieval consciousness, but minus the spontaneous spiritual infusion that used to accompany these forms. This, I think, is a reason why the medieval forms are so badly disenchanted, and exhibit such a dry, monochrome, dull, school dinners atmosphere. Lacking spiritual infusion, they motivate only feebly, sometimes imperceptibly feebly, and consequently the elite religious specialists become assimilated into mainstream elite social mores, which are currently those of bureaucratic totalitarianism, hence evil, hence anti-Christian. This can explain why the church leaders are the primary conduit for this worldly and socio-politically expedient corruption in the major Christian churches. And this, in turn, is why so many of the religious elite have turned away from them to immerse in the psychological gratifications, for example political spectacle excitement, media entertainment, self-gratifying pseudo-moralism, therapies and palliatives, of mainstream secular culture. Successful churches are nowadays enterprises, providing meeting places and organizing holidays, staging events, serving as cafes and theaters, hosting social and health services, and so forth. This, then, is our situation. The aim, I presume, if our Christian life is to be strongly enough motivated to transcend the pervasive pressure of secular society, is for each of us is to seek enchantment, i.e. infusion by divine spirit. That same spiritual infusion that mankind enjoyed in the past, but accepting that this is not possible either by passive immersion or by mediating phenomena. In sum, we need to seek the Spirit actively and consciously, or else it will not happen. And we need to seek to integrate ourselves not by willpower, which is now alienated from the divine, nor by integration with the unconscious, from which we are detached, and which is anyway not Christian. But instead by seeking reconnection with our own partially divine, eternal, original selves that are currently cut off and alienated, both by modern culture, and cut off also by the forms of medieval religion without the Spirit. Because it is our eternal self that is in direct contact with the divine, and which therefore knows when it is aligned with God, and when it is, usually, more or less in a state of disharmony with creation, i.e. sin. For us, willpower, and the disciplined seeking of conscious goals that characterized elite religious life in the medieval era of consciousness, needs to be secondary to seeking divine motivation, and divine guidance and correction, by this inner directed seeking consciously to establish direct contact with our eternal selves. This is something new and unprecedented, and therefore difficult, but not so difficult as it may seem. The first step is to recognize what is wanted, then to recognize when it happens. And the third step is not to expect too much. What is needed is sufficient Christian motivation to be able to navigate a Christian life in a hostile world, the ability to discern and the commitment to choose the divine and reject the demonic. We do not need, and shall not achieve, permanent and pervasive personal transformation for the better. We will neither become holy nor enlightened persons, unless we already are these things. But what is attainable, is a steady and robust desire to follow Jesus to resurrected eternal life in heaven. Christians should altogether stop saying heathen or pagan, when they mean something like mainstream modern materialist atheists. Bruce Charlton. The title says it all, pretty much. Christians should altogether stop saying heathen or pagan, since nowadays they don't exist, not really. Aside from the fact that both words originally meant something like rustics or country dwellers, ancient pagans and heathens were typically highly religious people, people who believed in the gods, the world of spirit, survival of the soul after death, and objective morality. As such, pagans and heathens bear near zero resemblance to the great mass of not Christians in the Western and developed world today. Nowadays, most people, including most self-identified Christians of whatever church or denomination, are this worldly, materialist atheists. We deny the reality or importance of the world of spirit, and believe that the universe of everything is not created, but instead arose and continued as a product of the operation of objective scientific factors that are alike indifferent to humankind and each man. Nothing like modern materialist atheists, i.e. like nearly all of us, was to be found in the ancient world. What is now normal, is something relatively new, merely several generations old. And the fact that there is no generally accepted term for almost everybody alive now, is indirect evidence of how taken for granted this worldview has become. We need to adopt a new term to refer to this new kind of person, this new phenomenon, but to equate modern this worldly, unreligious, aspiritual, anti-Christians with heathens and pagans, is just wrong. The divine purpose for individual persons, God gives us what we need, but not only what we need. Bruce Charlton. Each person's life has meaning, and that meaning is related to divine purpose. I think this is quite clear, if you know what to look for, in your own life, and the lives of those you know and love. I mean that people always, sooner or later, get the experience/s they most need for spiritual development. However, that does not mean that every individual automatically learns from each such experience. Indeed, very often, it seems that people do not learn from personal experiences that could be of great personal benefit. Or else people learn something wrong and contrary to divine purpose, from experiences they choose to lean a lesson contrary to God's hope and intentions. For instance, when some adverse experience that could be corrective if properly understood, is instead used as an excuse or rationale for doubling down on some sin, such as fear, resentment, or despair. But what makes all this less obvious is that not all of life is related to divine purpose. It is the nature of this life and world we are currently experiencing that there is entropy/death and there is evil. What this means is that things happen that are not part of the divine purpose. What God the Creator can do and does, is make the best of these things. So that if something happens to a person that is simply the result of entropy, some degenerative phenomenon or disease for example, or a consequence of evil motivation or service to evil, then consequently God will create, such as later to enable something to be gained, or salvaged, from this adverse occurrence. All of this points at the need for discernment, because understanding and learning are inevitably confused and clouded by the nature of ourselves and this world. The process of discerning and learning is one requiring active participation and culminating in freedom to choose how to be, and where to go next. We must be able to discern which experiences are God-given, and which are not. We must and inevitably do also work from our state of freedom. Creation is not something done to us. Divine purpose is that we participate in creation. And when an experience was not a part of divine purpose, we may need to be able to discern at what point God has, later, been able to present us with the possibility of deriving good from evil. We make such discernments partly from that which is divine within us, and partly, since the time of Jesus Christ, by guidance from the Holy Ghost. In other words, the capacity for true discernment is innate, and does not need to be derived from external sources, although, of course, external sources of guidance may be helpful in true discernment, just as external guidance is, here and now, more usually harmful. So much for this world we live in, this mixed world, this world that mixes divine creation and purpose with entropy and evil. A further thing that God purposes that we learn is that this mixed world, the primary creation, may be escaped after death and the separation of our spirit from our incarnate form, because after death, and only after death, we may follow Jesus Christ through resurrection with eternal life, and into a second creation that is heaven. Therefore, there will be divinely purposed experiences in this mortal life of ours, assuming we live long enough, that may be understood, if we are prepared to learn, as pointing towards the possibility of resurrection and heaven beyond death. I.e. experiences that may, if we discern aright, be understood as pointing towards salvation. Yet if, for whatever reason, we do not get such experiences during this mortal life, perhaps we die in the womb, or as infants, then such experiences as we need to be enabled to choose heaven, will surely be provided after death. But again we are free to learn from them or not, and to choose heaven or not. In sum, there is a divine purpose, or more than one purpose, for each person incarnated into this world, and this purpose is related to learning a lesson, or several lessons, during our life. Each person's purpose will be unique, because each person is unique, because each person had a premortal spirit life before human incarnation, which is why people are unique individuals from before birth. Because our purpose is unique, and because this world is a mixture of divinely created purpose with entropy and evil, discernment is required. We must recognize when we are being divinely taught, and when not. But even when our life's happenings are due to evil beings, or due to the innately entropic nature of this world, we should be alert to the ways in which divine creation can shape subsequent events, sooner or later to present us with possibilities for learning important life lessons. Meaning and purpose are not given, they need to be discerned. We need to learn from them, and that is our job. We also need to learn the right, i.e. divinely intended, lessons from them. Or death. The fourth gospel strongly suggests that death was regarded as the number one main problem of life as is on earth. Death is the problem that Jesus for which usually claims to be offering a solution.